The Alpha King had not smiled in 7 years, until the morning he found a young woman covered in mud, blood, and rain, desperately protecting 3 helpless wolf cubs with her own body. She had no sword, no royal blood, and no idea who was watching her from the cliff above. But when the king saw the cubs refuse to leave her side, his cold expression suddenly changed. He had no idea that this muddy stranger had just saved the last heirs of the ancient Moonfang bloodline, and that the wolves had chosen her for a reason that could expose the darkest betrayal inside his kingdom. The Alpha King had not smiled in 7 years. In Frostmere, people had stopped remembering what his smile looked like. Children whispered that King Kaelen had forgotten how. Older villagers said grief had frozen something inside him the night his wife and infant daughter died. Soldiers simply learned not to look too closely at his face. Then, one freezing morning, everything changed. Rain had fallen through the night, turning the mountain paths into black rivers of mud. Mist hung between the pine trees, and the cliffs above the northern forest disappeared beneath a grey curtain of cloud. Somewhere below those cliffs came a sound so faint that most people would have mistaken it for the wind. A whimper. Then another. Elara heard it. She stopped walking. Her worn brown cloak clung to her shoulders, heavy with rain. A basket of herbs hung from one hand, but she lowered it slowly as she listened. There it was again. A frightened cry. She stepped toward the ravine. The ground beneath her boots softened. One step became another. Then the earth gave way. Elara slid several feet down the muddy slope before catching a root with both hands. Her basket rolled away, spilling herbs into the rain. She did not scream. She looked down. 3 wolf cubs were trapped beneath a fallen pine. The smallest one was pinned beneath a branch, its white paws trembling. Another had blood on its hind leg. The third was trying desperately to crawl toward them, but a wall of wet earth blocked its path. Elara stared for only a heartbeat. Then she climbed down. The mud swallowed her boots. Cold water ran beneath her sleeves. She pushed both hands into the earth and began digging. The pine was enormous, its roots torn from the mountain like the fingers of some buried giant. Every time Elara moved a stone, another slid down the slope. Mud filled her hair. Rain ran across her face. Her fingers soon split against sharp roots. Still, she kept digging. "Easy," she whispered. The cub beneath the branch trembled. Elara pressed her shoulder against the wet timber. It did not move. She tried again. Her boots slipped. The branch crushed down another inch. The cub cried out. Something fierce entered Elara's eyes. She looked around, found a broken length of wood, wedged it beneath the branch, and pushed with everything she had. The timber lifted. Only a little. But it was enough. The cub dragged itself free. Elara caught it against her chest. Its tiny heart hammered beneath her palm. She wrapped it inside her cloak. Then she turned toward the second. Above her, somewhere beyond the mist, horses were approaching. But Elara never looked up. She had one more life to save. By the time she freed the third cub, her clothes were soaked through, her hands were bleeding, and mud covered her from her knees to her hair. She gathered all 3 animals against her body. That was when the horses appeared at the edge of the ravine. 6 royal guards dismounted. Their swords flashed beneath the grey morning light. And behind them came a tall black horse carrying a man dressed in dark armor beneath a heavy royal cloak. King Kaelen. He looked down into the ravine. For several seconds, nobody moved. The soldiers stared at the muddy young woman. Elara stared back. One cub slept against her chest. Another rested beneath her arm. The smallest had buried its nose beneath her chin. Kaelen's expression remained unreadable. Then his eyes moved to the fallen tree. To the blood on Elara's hands. To the 3 cubs. And finally to the woman herself. For the first time in 7 years, something inside the Alpha King shifted. Not joy. Not yet. But something dangerously close to it. "Your Majesty," one of the guards whispered, "those are the Moonfang cubs." Kaelen's horse took one slow step forward. Elara tightened her arms around the animals. She had no idea that the creatures she had just rescued were worth more than a kingdom. She had no idea that someone had tried to kill them. And she certainly did not know that by saving them, She had just placed herself directly between the Alpha King and the greatest betrayal of his life. The royal party brought Elara back to the castle before the storm could return. She expected questions. Instead, she was surrounded by silence. The guards rode on either side of her while Kaelen remained ahead, his black horse moving steadily through the wet forest. The 3 cubs were wrapped inside Elara's cloak, their tiny bodies pressed against her warmth. Every few minutes, one of them stirred. Each time, Elara looked down. The smallest had a cut across its paw. She tore a strip from the edge of her sleeve and carefully wrapped it. A guard noticed. "You're wasting royal cloth on a wolf." Elara looked at the cub. "It is bleeding." The guard frowned. "That was not my question." She tied the cloth. "It is still my answer." The soldier fell silent. Kaelen heard. He did not turn around. But the corner of his mouth moved almost imperceptibly. The castle of Frostmere appeared through the trees before sunset. It stood against the mountains like a fortress carved from winter itself, with high stone walls, narrow towers, silver banners, and enormous gates reinforced with black iron. Snow covered the upper roofs even though autumn had not yet ended. When Elara entered, servants stopped what they were doing. Whispers followed her. The muddy girl. The wolf rescuer. The stranger from the forest. But Elara barely noticed. The cubs were cold. She carried them into the royal infirmary and immediately began preparing warm water. A royal healer stared at her. "You cannot simply take over this room." Elara looked toward the trembling animals. "Then tell me what you would do." The healer opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Elara warmed blankets beside the fire and cleaned the cubs one by one. Kaelen watched from the doorway. He had seen soldiers fight through blizzards. He had seen men die without crying. He had watched entire villages burn. But this woman, exhausted and covered in mud, seemed completely unaware that a king was standing 10 feet away. Her world had narrowed to 3 frightened animals. The largest cub lifted its head. It looked toward Kaelen. Then it turned away. The king almost smiled. Almost. Later that evening, the truth about the animals was revealed. The 3 cubs belonged to the Moonfang bloodline, an ancient line of wolves that had guarded Frostmere's rulers for generations. Old stories claimed that Moonfang wolves could sense truth in the hearts of men and would refuse to bow to anyone carrying the blood of a traitor. Only 3 remained. And they had disappeared 2 days earlier. Kaelen had personally joined the search. His soldiers had searched every valley, every cave, every river bank. Yet Elara had found them in less than an hour. That troubled him. More troubling was the place where she found them. The royal tracker discovered something beneath the mud near the fallen tree. A piece of silver. Kaelen crouched beside it. It was a royal seal. His face hardened. The seal had been deliberately buried. Someone had taken the cubs there. Someone had trapped them. Someone wanted them dead. Elara watched from a few steps away. "What does it mean?" Kaelen looked at her. "It means you were not the first person to find those wolves." The room became still. "Who was?" "We don't know." Before anyone could say more, the sound came. A sharp whistle. Kaelen's head snapped toward the window. An arrow smashed through the glass. Elara froze. Kaelen moved faster. He seized her by the arm and pulled her behind a stone pillar as another arrow struck the wall where her head had been. Guards drew their swords. The cubs cried out. Kaelen's face changed completely. The grief vanished. The king appeared. "Seal the gates." His voice was quiet. That made it more frightening. "No one leaves the castle." Outside, footsteps disappeared into the rain. But whoever had fired the arrows had made one mistake. The first arrow had missed Elara. The second had not. It had struck the wooden table beside the cubs. And tied to its shaft was a small piece of black cloth bearing the symbol of a silver crown split in 2. A symbol Elara had seen before. Inside her mother's old healing journal. Elara was given a chamber in the eastern tower. She did not sleep. The castle felt too large. Too quiet. Wind moved through the stone corridors, making the old windows tremble. Somewhere below, guards changed shifts. Boots echoed across the courtyard. Elara sat beside the fire with her mother's journal open across her knees. The book was old enough that the leather had become soft. She turned the pages carefully. Most contained drawings of plants, herbs, animal wounds, and remedies. Then she found the symbol. A silver crown split in two. Her fingers stopped. Beneath the drawing was a sentence written in her mother's handwriting. Some wounds are hidden because kingdoms are afraid of what will bleed when they are opened. Elara read it twice. Then she heard footsteps. She closed the book. Kaelen entered. He had removed his armor. Without it, he looked less like a king and more like a tired man who had carried too much for too long. His dark hair was damp from the rain. He looked at the cubs. They are sleeping. Elara nodded. One still has a fever. Kaelen approached. The largest cub stirred. Its eyes opened. It saw the king. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the cub crawled toward him. Kaelen stopped breathing. He lowered himself slowly. The animal placed one tiny paw against his hand. The king stared at it. His fingers trembled. Elara noticed. She said nothing. The cub climbed into his lap. Kaelen looked down at the creature. Something painful crossed his face. My daughter used to do that. Elara's eyes softened. Kaelen looked toward the fire. She was barely old enough to walk. He swallowed. She would climb into my lap whenever she heard thunder. The fire cracked. Neither spoke. The king's gaze remained fixed on the cub. For years, he had refused to speak about his family. Now the memory had slipped through the wall he had built around himself. Elara did not offer pity. She simply moved another log into the fire. The flames rose. The cub curled against Kaelen's chest. And then it happened. A tiny paw pressed against his beard. Kaelen looked down. A breath escaped him. Not a sigh. Not grief. A laugh. It was quiet. Almost unfamiliar. But it was real. Elara stared. Kaelen looked at her as though he had forgotten someone else was in the room. For one brief moment, the weight disappeared from his face. He smiled. The door opened. A guard stopped dead. He had never seen it. Neither had the servant behind him. Within minutes, the impossible had become a whisper moving through the castle. The Alpha King had smiled. But while the castle celebrated the smallest crack in its king's grief, Lord Varick stood alone beneath the fortress. He was Kaelen's commander. The man trusted with the army. The man who had stood beside the king after the deaths of his wife and daughter. He was also the man who had buried the truth beneath the northern ravine. Varick held a dagger over the sleeping cubs. The animals were locked inside the royal kennel. He looked toward the dark corridor. No guards. No witnesses. He raised the blade. Then one cub opened its eyes. It stared directly at him. Varick's hand stopped. The animal began to growl. Not like a frightened pup. Like something that remembered him. Varick's face went pale. You should have died in the ravine. The cub growled again. And somewhere beneath the castle, an old bell began to ring. The bell rang 3 times. By dawn, the castle was in chaos. The kennel doors had been forced open. One guard was unconscious. The cubs were alive. But someone had tried to reach them during the night. Kaelen ordered every entrance sealed. Varick arrived moments later with armed soldiers, wearing the expression of a loyal commander. My king, someone inside the castle is helping the assassin. Kaelen looked at him. Then perhaps we should begin by asking who has access to every corridor. Varick's eyes hardened. But before the confrontation could deepen, Elara found something hidden inside her mother's journal. A loose page had been stitched into the binding. She pulled it free. Behind it was a letter. The ink had faded. The handwriting belonged to her mother. The wolf survived. Elara's heart began pounding. She read further. He carried proof of the betrayal. Then another line. The king must never trust the commander. Elara stopped breathing. Varick. Her mother had known. Years ago, a wounded royal wolf had reached their cottage after the night Kaelen's wife and daughter died. Her mother had treated its injuries. She had discovered a royal insignia attached to its collar, stained with blood belonging to one of the king's closest guards. Before she could tell anyone, she disappeared. Elara had always believed her mother had died from illness. Now she understood. Her mother had been murdered. And the wolf had carried the evidence. The Moonfang cubs were not merely sacred. They had inherited the scent of the bloodline involved in the betrayal. They could recognize the traitor. Elara rushed toward the royal chamber. She found Kaelen standing beside the window. When she showed him the letter, his face became completely still. Varick. Kaelen said the name like a man tasting poison. I trusted him. Elara looked at him. So did my mother. For several seconds, the king could not speak. Then a bell sounded from the western tower. Smoke rose over the castle. The royal kennel was burning. Kaelen ran. Elara followed. Flames climbed the wooden beams. The cubs cried from inside. Guards rushed forward, but a collapsing door blocked the entrance. Kaelen grabbed a fallen shield and smashed through the burning timber. Heat struck his face. Your Majesty. He disappeared inside. Elara heard the cubs screaming. Then the roof groaned. She did not think. She ran into the fire. Smoke burned her eyes. She found Kaelen beneath a beam, one arm around the smallest cub. The other two were trapped behind a broken cage. Elara crawled through the smoke. Together they freed them. Then the ceiling cracked. Kaelen pushed Elara forward. A burning beam fell. She shoved the smallest cub away. The beam struck her shoulder. Pain exploded through her body. Kaelen turned. For one terrible second, he saw her trapped beneath the timber. Something inside him broke. He lifted the beam with both hands. Move! Elara pulled herself free. The king carried her. He did not care who saw. He ran through the flames with Elara in his arms and the cubs following behind. They reached the hidden passage beneath the castle. But there was no safety waiting there. The corridor opened into the lower fortress. Outside, horns sounded. Soldiers were shouting. Kaelen stopped. Through a narrow opening, he saw the royal banners being torn down. Varick's men had taken the gates. A messenger stumbled toward them. His face was white. Your Majesty. He dropped to one knee. Lord Varick has declared you dead. Kaelen stared toward the fortress he had ruled for 15 years. The gates closed. The bells rang. And for the first time in his life, the Alpha King had no army. Only a wounded woman. 3 wolf cubs. And the truth. He looked at Elara. She was pale, but she was standing. Can you walk? She nodded. Kaelen looked toward the forest beyond the mountains. Then we leave. Behind them, Frostmere's gate slammed shut. And the king vanished into the wilderness. The forest swallowed them before sunrise. For 3 days, they traveled through places no royal army could easily follow. Kaelen abandoned his crown. His royal cloak was torn into strips to bandage Elara's shoulder. The cubs stayed close. At night, they slept beneath trees while snow gathered on the branches above them. Kaelen had never lived like this. He had spent most of his life surrounded by stone walls, servants, guards, horses, and maps. Now he learned how to gather dry wood, how to read a mountain trail, how to sleep with one eye open. Elara watched him struggle with a cooking pot one evening. He stared at the blackened remains of their meal. It was supposed to be soup. Elara looked inside. It is mostly smoke. For the first time, Kaelen laughed. The sound surprised them both. The cubs lifted their heads. Then the largest one walked away from the fire. It stopped beneath a pine tree. Looked back. Then continued. Elara followed. Kaelen came behind her. The cub led them through a narrow passage between 2 cliffs. Beyond it stood a ruined stone sanctuary. The roof had collapsed centuries ago. Moss covered the walls. Moon-shaped carvings surrounded the entrance. Kaelen stepped inside. The cubs became still. On the far wall was a carving of a woman kneeling beside a wolf. Beneath it was an ancient symbol. The same silver crown split in 2. Elara touched the stone. The wall seemed to vibrate beneath her hand. Then she noticed the words carved below. The Moonfang does not choose the strongest. It chooses the one who protects life when no reward is promised. Kaelen looked at her. Elara slowly understood. The bond had already chosen her. Not because she was royal. Not because she possessed magic. Because she had crawled into a collapsing ravine for 3 creatures that could give her nothing in return. The sanctuary was their only shelter. But it did not remain hidden for long. That night, distant horns echoed between the mountains. Varick had found them. Hundreds of soldiers surrounded the sanctuary before dawn. Kaelen stood at the entrance with a sword in his hand. Elara gathered the cubs behind her. They will come for them. Kaelen looked at her. They will come through me first. The attack began. Arrows struck the stone walls. Fire spread across the old wooden beams. Kaelen fought in the doorway, moving with the strength of a man who had finally found something worth defending. But there were too many. Elara saw soldiers approaching from the eastern side. She knew they would reach the cubs. She made a decision. She grabbed a burning torch. Then she ran in the opposite direction. The soldiers followed. Kaelen saw her disappear into the trees. His face changed. Elara! She kept running. Branches tore at her clothes. Smoke filled the forest. She wanted the soldiers away from the sanctuary. Away from the cubs. Away from Kaelen. She stumbled. A soldier reached for her. She struck his hand with the torch. Then another appeared. She backed toward the cliff. There was nowhere left to go. Behind her, the sanctuary burned. Kaelen broke through the soldiers and raced toward her. But Varick stepped between them. The 2 men faced each other among falling ash. 7 years of grief stood between them. Kaelen's sword rose. Varick smiled. You were always weak. Kaelen's eyes hardened. No. His voice was quiet. I was grieving. Then the smallest Moonfang cub stepped out of the burning sanctuary. It stood on the stone threshold. Its chest rose. The mountains became silent. The cub opened its mouth and released a howl unlike anything Elara had ever heard. The sound rolled across the valley. 1 wolf answered. Then another. Then dozens. Then hundreds. The forest came alive. Eyes appeared between the trees. Silver bodies moved through the darkness. The Moonfang pack had heard its call. And they were coming home. The first wolf crossed the battlefield at dawn. It moved silently through the smoke. Then another appeared. Then 10. Then 50. Soon the slopes above the sanctuary were covered with wolves. Black wolves. Grey wolves. White wolves shining beneath the morning snow. They did not attack blindly. They moved like a living wall between the soldiers and the sanctuary. Varick stepped backward. For the first time, fear entered his eyes. The Moonfang cubs stood together. Their fur lifted. They stared at him. Every wolf in the valley turned toward the same man. The soldiers began lowering their weapons. Some had already understood. Others needed only one look at the commander they had followed. Kaelen walked toward Varick. His sword hung at his side. He no longer looked like the king who had ruled through fear. He looked like the man who had lost everything and finally found something worth protecting. Varick attacked. Their swords collided. Steel rang through the burning sanctuary. Varick fought with rage. Kaelen fought with purpose. Every strike carried years of grief. Every movement remembered a wife who had died. A daughter who had never grown old enough to remember him. A kingdom built on a lie. But Kaelen did not kill him in anger. When Varick fell, the king lowered his sword. The cubs approached. The smallest sniffed Varick's hand. It immediately recoiled. A growl passed through the pack. The truth needed no courtroom. Varick had been the traitor. He had helped arrange the deaths of Kaelen's family. He had ordered Elara's mother silenced. He had trapped the Moonfang cubs. And he had burned the royal kennels to destroy the last evidence. The soldiers turned on him. The kingdom would hear the truth before sunset. But Elara was not there to witness it. She had been injured during the fight. Kaelen found her near the edge of the forest. She was sitting against a tree, one hand pressed against her shoulder. He knelt. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he carefully examined the wound. You came back. Elara looked at him. I said I would. Something changed in his face. Not the smile from the night before. Something deeper. Relief. He helped her stand. Together they walked back toward the sanctuary. Behind them, the wolves followed. When they returned to Frostmere, the people lined the streets. The gates opened. The bells rang. But Kaelen did not ride through them like a conquering king. He walked. Beside Elara. The 3 Moonfang cubs followed at their heels. In the great courtyard, before nobles, soldiers, servants, and villagers, Kaelen removed the crown from his head. He turned toward Elara. She looked uncertain. He placed the crown in his own hands rather than hers. Then he bowed his head. The entire courtyard fell silent. The Alpha King bowed to the woman who had entered a ravine for 3 helpless animals when no one was watching. "She saved my family," he said. Elara's eyes filled with tears. Kaelen looked toward the people. "She saved me too." No one spoke. Then an old woman in the crowd began to cry. Another person lowered their head. Soon the entire courtyard was silent with respect. Years passed. Frostmere changed. The Moonfang Sanctuary was rebuilt, not as a fortress, but as a refuge. Injured wolves were brought there. Abandoned children found warm beds beside the old stone hearths. Travelers who once feared the forest began visiting it again. And Kaelen changed with the kingdom. He laughed more. He walked among villagers without guards. He remembered his wife without drowning in grief. He spoke about his daughter without looking away. And Elara never became a queen who sat behind a throne. She remained the woman who preferred muddy boots to silk shoes. One spring morning, years after the battle, Elara walked into the forest carrying a basket of herbs. She heard laughter. Human laughter. Then the sound of wolves crashing through the bushes. Kaelen appeared between the trees. His clothes were covered in mud. His hair was full of leaves. One Moonfang wolf was behind him. Another was running circles around his legs. The king had apparently lost a battle against 3 playful animals. Elara stared. Then she laughed. Kaelen stopped. For a moment, he looked embarrassed. Then he smiled. Not the small smile from the castle. Not the uncertain smile of a man remembering how happiness felt. A real smile. Warm. Open. Free. The wolves gathered around them. The forest smelled of pine and wet earth. Sunlight slipped through the branches. Elara reached out and brushed a streak of mud from his cheek. "You look terrible." Kaelen laughed again. "Then I suppose you should rescue me." She smiled. "I already did." The king looked at her. The wolves settled quietly around their feet. Far above them, snow still rested on the mountain peaks, but spring had reached Frostmere at last. And perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all. Elara had entered the story with nothing but an old cloak, a basket of herbs, and a heart that could not ignore suffering. Kaelen had entered it carrying a crown, an army, and 7 years of grief. But somewhere between a muddy ravine and a ruined sanctuary, they had found something neither had been searching for. A family, a home, and a reason to smile again. The Alpha King had once believed that love was the thing that had destroyed him. Now he understood the truth. Love had not been what broke him. It was what taught him how to live after the breaking. And beneath the ancient pines of Frostmere, surrounded by the wolves Elara had once saved, Kaelen finally stopped being the king who had survived his past. He became the man who had a future. And this time, when the wolves lifted their heads and howled beneath the golden spring sky, he did not hear a warning. He heard them calling him home.